Hello and welcome to Talking About Scottish Property, and this is not just Ross and Chris. Today we have Colin Macmillan from Glasgow Property Letting, GPL, prominent letting agency in the Glasgow area. Hello, Colin.
Hello, guys. How are we doing? Thanks for welcoming me on board. It's lovely.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming, Colin.
We are going to talk about, first off, the rent increases, potentially a tsunami of rent increases coming at the beginning of April. Fair to say, or not?
I would say it's definitely slightly more welcome than it was last week. I think a lot of landlords out there are quite pleasantly surprised, I think, by the U-turn in the Scottish Government. Obviously, 3%. Potentially, you may see a tsunami. I think a lot of landlords maybe see the overcautious approach as well, and maybe hold fire. 3% on an 850 rent is about £25, so it's not going to cut too much of the mustard, if that makes sense. I think they were obviously hoping to be able to put rents up by considerably more than that, but that's, it's a welcome relief anyway. Put it that way. It's a welcome relief.
And comparing it to the purpose-built student accommodation and the social sector, which the rent caps have just disappeared, haven't they? There's no rent caps for those sectors. Why do you think the private landlords were viewed differently to those sectors?
Personally, from a political point of view, from a vote, there's a lot of this, like 240,000 private tenanted properties in Scotland. Obviously, the amount of tenants that are in the property versus the amount of landlords gives the SNP and the Greens obviously a much more of a swing for votes and so on. Call me cynical, but I think that could be one of the main routes. Landlords are deemed as being, the Antichrist. They're in a position where they're there. There are some fantastic landlords, really good landlords. There are some bad landlords. And I think that's across the board. We've got to take the rough with the smooth as well. I think it's still, we still have to be in a position where it's attractive enough as an investment opportunity for corporate investors, student accommodation, buy to rent, social landlords, slightly different scenario. They seem to have been, let away with it slightly easier, I would say. But the private rented sector, I think, hopefully is as robust as we think it might be, and it's still a good place to see investments on the long term. So it's very difficult to say. 3%, as I say, is a lot better. There's, cost of living is horrendous out there. There's a lot of tenants are finding it tough, and we do appreciate that, and many landlords are sympathetic to that cause. But I think the Scottish Government, we're forgetting that landlords had costs. They're in the same boat. Their costs are increasing. Their mortgages are increasing. They're maybe in a position where they're not in a position to be able to rent out anymore.
Yeah.
They have to sell.
Because I think one of the reasons for lifting the cap on the social sector was to allow social sector to use funds to maintain these properties. That was one of the reasons. And so, why is that not the case for private landlords using the funds from the rent to pay for maintenance, etc.? But I suppose it touches on a little bit around about what is the long-term strategy for the Scottish Government for the PRS. There was a prominent quote from one of the Green MSPs recently, I think it's Ross Greer, and he said, and I've had to write it down here, he said that landlords just aren't contributing anything useful to society, which was a horrendous thing for an MSP to say, isn't it? In that type, to use that type of language, because landlords are contributing. They're providing safe, quality accommodation where maybe the Scottish Government isn't providing that accommodation and allowing to a place to stay. So it seems strange. I mean, they are. I just don't know what their long term. They obviously think that they shouldn't be landlords and everybody should own their own home. What do you think? Where do you think they're heading with this?
Well, I think if you look at the statistics and say in the whole of Scotland, 240,000 private rented properties, and you remove these because the government doesn't particularly partake of private landlords, you're then in a position where are you going to find 240,000 properties if all these landlords decide to sell it? You know, you could give tenant an option to buy, but that's probably not going to happen. They're probably not going to be able to afford mortgages. That's the reason they're in rented accommodation. They're in this transient, flexible, because if they can't afford a certain amount of rent, potentially you could quite easily move to a property that is less of a rent.
Yeah, and it's not all to do with being affordable. Sometimes tenants just prefer to be in that flexibility of I'm working in Glasgow for a short space of time. I need accommodation because I'm there on a 12-month contract. I know that I'll be leaving after that 12-month contract, so renting sort of suits me perfectly.
We hadn't discussed the idea of discussing this before this meeting, but what about the legal case that both Property Mark and SAL are taking to the Scottish Government to challenge a lot of their... Is it specifically the rent freeze that they are challenging? Is it what is it, the whole thing? What's the detail on it?
I think it's the whole thing. I think the main thing obviously was the rent freeze. The moratorium on evictions as well. That was, which we understand. I mean, obviously we're living in a very it's a very difficult time at the moment. Obviously with Russia and Ukraine and so on and so forth. I mean, obviously we have to see how that pans out. But it is expecting. We're now in midwinter, the winter discontent. Call it what you like. Tenants are obviously having real problems, and we have to be sympathetic and empathetic about this. But I think if you're in a position where we have to find accommodation, there's accommodation in multiple ways. There's the build to rent mainly is for student / young professionals. That's the kind of market there. The student accommodation, which we, Glasgow West End, city centre is obviously phenomenally powerful. We're in a position where that may, I think every second building going up was student accommodation, but that's only one sector of the market. That's not giving the kind of longer term aspect, And I think base is very political, I think we're in a position where if the government are going to build properties to actually rent out, then we have to find out where they're going to be. They're not going to be prime West End locations. They're going to be, or city centre. They're going to be out of town, arterial routes, so on and so forth. But where all these houses are going to come from, I don't know. I don't know.
So over the last 12 months, what feedback is your landlords telling you about the direction of travel that Scottish Government are in? Are they very vocal to you? Are you finding people are deciding to sell up because of policy changes?
I think a few landlords have taken the option that it's just not, and maybe it's a snapshot decision, Ross. They're maybe getting to, we're not dealing with it. We have one chap who is very pro SNP, had been all his life. He's a private landlord, and his dad was SNP and all the rest. He built up a portfolio of 10 properties. That is his business. And of course, I'm telling him, I'm giving the information from the Scottish government, the directive, that say, well, you can't increase your rent. And he is absolutely fuming. Now, obviously looking at the legal case, I think that was the catalyst that gave the the U-turn last week, where Patrick Harvey then, said it wasn't, it's a slightly more sympathetic approach than he had been previously, which was with no consultation of SAL or Property Mark, whatever, They were based in a position where it was a directive and everything else is increasing in price, but rents couldn't. And I think landlords felt, quite rightly so, they felt victimised and targeted. And I think a lot of landlords have said, well, on the back of that, right, that's it, we're out of here, we're selling up and all the rest of it. But as a company, we haven't really seen, we've seen a few landlords who maybe said, look, maybe they're coming to the end, they're retiring, they want to release the equity. That's slightly different, but I think it was the catalyst that just, said, right, okay, now's a good time to get out.
So
but likewise, on saying that, there's other investors who we're seeing are looking to get in. So, for every property that's sold, as you well know, there's a buyer for it.
Yeah, indeed. So before the rent increase, I suppose the inability to increase your rent up to the 31st of March, and obviously you get your 3-month notice period from the 1st of April to increase your rent if you choose to do so for your current tenancy. Before that was in place, what did your landlords do for rent increases on an annual basis for your portfolio? Did they increase the rent by 3%, or did they just move tenants in, and then the tenants looking after the property, they're paying the rent on time, I don't want to increase the rent?
Some landlords are very like that, Ross. They say, well, I'm quite happy. I've got a good tenant in, who's paying the rent in time. I don't want to. And I've had this discussion, obviously when the PRT came in, they gave the option to do a rent review every year, once in every year, a 12-month period. So, but then obviously after 9 months, you're already thinking about putting 3-month rent review notification into the tenant. But a lot of landlords, didn't, a year ago, well, last December, I think people were talking rent reviews and all the rest of it, and it was potentially rate of inflation. Now, the rate of inflation back a year ago is not what it is now, and the rate of inflation, obviously, the whole thing is snowballed, I would say, in the past year. The inflation rate, interest rates gone up, there's all this kind of uncertainty. But let's say the diligent landlord who is sympathetic to his tenant, they're in a position where most of them are quite happy to stay put. The transient rental market we deal with, and the tenants are only going to be there maybe 1, 2, 3 years, something in that kind of region. I think the average we worked out was about 3.5 years. Okay, student population are there for 1 to 2 years, then they move on. There are some obviously more out of town and residential areas where you get schooling and so on and so forth, where people maybe are there long term, 14 years, they're going right back to the staying in the short-term tenancy. So it's a difficult scenario, I think, but it's the perfect storm. But the perfect storm has now been slightly lightened by the announcement last week, to allow, a 3% increase. So hopefully, I think a lot of landlords will still not. They'll probably say, well, 3%, it's not great. Well, I put it up just to rock the boat. I mean, that's us coming out of the kind of winter time into springtime. Okay, they're not maybe paying as much in utility bills and so on, but the cost of living is still going to be there unless something drastic happens in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah.